When the millionaire lifted his glass and said, "Play the violin, and I'll marry you," the ballroom fell silent. Everyone thought he was joking, but when Amara raised her trembling bow, no one could have imagined what came next. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Amara was a small-town violin teacher who believed music could heal anything. She met Alexander, a wealthy businessman who promised to help her chase her dream. For months, he showed her kindness, told her she was destined for greatness, even gifted her a new violin. She began to believe in him and in herself. Then came the gala night. Under glittering chandeliers, he made that promise in front of everyone. "Play for me, and I'll make you mine." She played through tears, every note trembling with hope. But halfway through, a woman shouted her name. It was Lydia, her estranged sister, accusing Alexander of lies and Amara of forgetting her roots. The music stopped. The crowd murmured. Amara dropped her bow and ran. Months later, Amara returned with a quiet performance. No grand stage, no promises, just her and her sister, side by side. She whispered, "Tonight, I play for forgiveness." When the final note ended, Lydia cried and embraced her. Alexander, watching from the back, placed a rose on the stage and left without a word. Sometimes love doesn't end with vows, it ends with truth. If you were Amara, would you have played that night, or walked away? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that touch the heart. She came to the Morel mansion with nothing but a suitcase, a tattered violin, and a promise to her dying mother, never stop playing. But for months, Amara hid her gift, scrubbing marble floors, polishing silver, and serving guests who never looked her in the eye. The staff called her quiet, the neighbors called her lucky, but in truth, she was surviving, not living. Amara had once dreamed of concert halls and velvet curtains, but life had other plans. After her mother passed, she sold her music sheets for rent, her bow for food. By the time she arrived at Alexander Morel's estate on the cold New England coast, music had become a ghost she dared not chase. They said Alexander was brilliant, a man who could turn stone into gold, numbers into empires. But they also whispered of his arrogance, of the nights he sat alone in the West Wing, staring at a broken violin that belonged to his late wife. He hadn't heard music in years, not since the night she died. Servants learned to move quietly, to never mention melodies. The halls stayed silent, except for the ticking of clocks and the sea wind brushing against the windows. One evening, as Amara dusted the old library, she found the broken violin case resting beneath a portrait, a woman smiling faintly, bow in hand. Something in that painted gaze stopped her. She wanted to play, even just one note, to feel her mother's promise again. But fear held her still. What if he heard? What if she lost the only job keeping her alive? For weeks the thought haunted her. She'd hear the sound of rain on the roof and imagine it as applause. She'd hum quietly as she cleaned, always stopping whenever footsteps echoed down the hall. She missed the feeling of strings against her fingertips, the warmth of creation. In her silence, she felt smaller each day. But everything changed one stormy night when the power went out and the house sank into darkness. As thunder rolled and candles flickered, Amara reached for the violin. She didn't think, she simply played. A soft, trembling melody filled the air, drifting through corridors long starved of sound. Upstairs, Alexander froze. The notes of a song he thought he'd buried with his wife echoed faintly through the mansion. He stood, stunned, his glass of brandy still in his hand. That melody, his wife's favorite. His chest tightened as he followed the sound down the hallway, drawn like a ghost to a light he'd forgotten existed. He hadn't heard music in years, not since the night his wife died. But now, someone else was playing her song. Each morning, Amara would dust the old music room, careful not to linger too long near the glass case that held the violin of Alexander's late wife. It sat there untouched, a relic of love and loss, preserved like time itself had stopped. Sometimes, as sunlight hit the glass, she imagined the sound it once made, delicate, tender, alive, but she never dared to touch it. Until one night, the storm outside howled, the house empty except for her. The wind rattled the shutters, and the candles burned low. Something inside her broke that night. The silence, the fear, the years of hiding her gift. She opened the glass case with trembling hands. The violin was lighter than she imagined, its strings worn but still breathing history. She drew the bow gently across, and a soft note filled the air, then another. The melody rose, fragile yet familiar, a song her mother once played to calm her to sleep. But upstairs, Alexander froze. That melody. It couldn't be. His wife's favorite. No one else knew it. He followed the sound down the corridor, each step heavier than the last. His heart raced, anger, grief, disbelief twisting together. He opened the music room door, and there she was, a maid, standing in the golden glow of candlelight, holding her violin. His voice was sharp, cold. "Who gave you permission to touch that instrument?" The bow slipped from Amara's hand. Her knees trembled. "I'm sorry, sir. I just missed the sound." The silence that followed was unbearable. For a moment he saw not the servant, but the echo of the woman he once loved. The way Amara's hands shook, the sadness in her eyes. It all reminded him of a night long ago when his wife had wept before playing that very song. He should have fired her. He wanted to. Yet something in her playing haunted him. The sound lingered in his mind even after she'd fled the room. That night he poured a drink but didn't touch it. Instead he sat in the dark, remembering her laugh, her music, the promise he'd failed to keep. The next morning he said nothing, but Amara noticed the door to the music room was left unlocked. Days passed, weeks. Each evening, when she thought he was gone, she'd play again, softly, carefully. But she was wrong. He would stand at the end of the hallway, unseen, listening. Every note pulled him closer to a part of himself he'd buried, the part that could still feel. She didn't know it yet, but she had awakened something in him. Not love, not yet, but memory. The kind that hurts and heals at the same time. And though he said nothing, he began leaving the window slightly open before dusk, just enough for her to hear the sea. As if giving permission, without words, to let the music breathe again. From that night on, Alexander found himself drawn to the sound and to her. But some melodies, once awakened, refuse to stay silent, and not all hearts can survive what comes next. In the weeks that followed, the mansion changed in ways no one could explain. The air no longer felt heavy, the silence no longer stung. Each night, when the house fell asleep, Amara would slip into the music room, close her eyes, and let the violin speak. She played softly, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes tender, as though every note was a prayer to the mother she'd lost. And upstairs, behind the half-closed study door, Alexander would listen. He never entered, he never interrupted, but every song loosened the weight around his heart, the grief he'd worn like armor since his wife's death. She didn't know he was listening. He didn't know she was healing. Yet, through the thin air between floors, something fragile began to form. A connection built not on words but on sound. On nights when Amara played the lullaby her mother wrote, Alexander found himself remembering his wife's laughter. On mornings when she scrubbed the marble steps, she caught glimpses of him watching from the balcony, silent but softer than before. Two lonely hearts, mourning different ghosts, began to find rhythm in each other's silence. One afternoon, when the spring light poured through the tall windows, Alexander appeared in the doorway of the music room. His expression unreadable, his tone firm. "You can play, can't you?" Then play for my guests tonight. Let's see what all the silence has been hiding." Amara froze. Her heart thudded against her ribs. "You want me to play in front of them?" she whispered. He turned away, sipping his drink. "If you can play, play." And then he left. That evening she sat alone by the fire, staring at her reflection in the violin's polished wood. Memories of her mother flooded in. The long nights of practice, the promise she'd made. She had played for love once, for comfort, never for judgment. The thought of performing in front of the wealthy, elegant guests who barely saw her as human filled her with dread. What if she failed? What if they laughed? Yet something inside her refused to stay silent. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the ache of all those years living unseen. When the clock struck 8, she walked into the grand hall, violin in hand. The guests turned, whispering, confused. A maid with an instrument. How strange. Alexander stood by the piano, eyes fixed on her, unreadable. She bowed her head and took her place. She lifted the bow, her hands trembling, but as soon as the first note filled the room, time seemed to slow. The chatter faded. Even Alexander's guests, polished, proud, bored, fell quiet. Her melody was raw, imperfect, but filled with truth. Grief and hope entwined in every stroke of the bow. It wasn't performance, it was confession. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was deafening. Then applause, hesitant at first, then full, echoing through the hall. Amara stood frozen, tears blurring her vision. Alexander didn't clap. He simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that said more than any praise could. She returned to her room that night unsure what to feel: pride, shame, confusion. But before she could sleep, she found a note slipped under her door. It read only 4 words: "You made them listen." But this was no ordinary request. That night, as the applause faded, Alexander's plan had only just begun, and Amara was about to learn why he had truly asked her to play. The night of the grand ball arrived, a celebration of power, money, and vanity. The mansion glowed with golden light, the chandeliers reflected in a sea of champagne glasses. Laughter drifted through every hall, but in the corner of the room stood Amara, quiet, uncertain, clutching her violin as though it were armor. She wore a simple dress borrowed from another maid, the fabric slightly frayed at the seams. Around her the guests shimmered in silk and arrogance. They spoke of art and business, of things they didn't understand but loved to control, and when they noticed her, their whispers began. "Is she part of the entertainment?" one woman asked behind a jeweled fan. "A servant with a violin?" Another laughed. The sting burned deep, but Amara said nothing. She kept her head bowed, waiting for Alexander's signal, the man who had both given her courage and unknowingly set her heart trembling. Alexander arrived late, his smile wide, his steps a little uneven from the wine. He was charming tonight, the perfect host. The guests adored him, and he basked in their attention. Then, with a careless grin, he turned toward the corner where Amara stood. "Ah, yes," he said, voice loud enough to carry across the ballroom. "Our hidden gem. She says she can play. Tell you what, if she impresses me tonight, I'll marry her." The laughter that followed was cruel, sharp as shattered glass. Glasses clinked, someone gasped, and another shouted, "Play us a love song then, little maid." Amara's face went pale, her fingers trembled. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, mocking, hungry, waiting for her to break. And Alexander, still smiling, didn't realize that with one careless sentence he'd turned her gift into a spectacle. To them, it was a joke, but to her, it was everything she'd ever feared, every humiliation, every moment of being unseen. And yet, somewhere beneath that pain, something shifted. She remembered her mother's promise. She remembered why she played. Slowly she lifted her head. The room blurred. The laughter, the perfume, the gleaming chandeliers, all faded until there was only the violin in her hands. She raised the bow. At first her fingers trembled. A single fragile note slipped into the air. Someone chuckled. But then her hand steadied. The melody deepened. It grew, soft, aching, then fierce. Each note carried a lifetime of hunger and heartbreak. The chatter stopped. Glasses lowered. The music swelled, filling the marble hall with something too human to mock. The guests stood frozen, their laughter gone, their faces changed. The melody burned through the room like truth itself, and Alexander, standing at the center, felt his chest tighten. He didn't see a maid anymore. He saw a woman, brave, trembling, magnificent. He saw the reflection of every dream he'd buried since the night his wife died. When the final note faded, silence claimed the ballroom. No one dared to speak. The sound of the sea outside crept in, and Amara lowered her violin. Her eyes glistened, but her voice never wavered. For the first time in years, she had played, not for approval, not for love, but for herself. That night, something in Alexander broke, and something in Amara was reborn. But neither of them knew that every choice made under that chandelier would soon come at a cost. The melody changed. What began as soft and hesitant now burned with life, a confession in sound. Each note carried a piece of Amara's story, the ache of hunger, the chill of loss, the tender echo of her mother's voice whispering, "Never stop playing." The room fell under her spell. Her bow moved faster, sharper, the fury of a woman unseen, unheard, fighting her way through the silence of years. Then, without warning, the anger melted into sorrow. A mournful tune rose, so fragile it felt as though the air itself might break. It was no longer a performance, it was truth. The millionaire's laughter died long before her final note. Even Alexander, his pride stripped bare, stood motionless, his glass lowered, his eyes fixed on her. The melody softened to a whisper, trembling on the edge of tears, then faded into silence so heavy it made the chandeliers tremble. For a long moment, no one dared move. Then one person began to clap. Slow, uncertain. Another joined. And suddenly the entire hall erupted into applause, echoing like a wave. But Amara didn't bow, she didn't smile. Her fingers were still shaking. Without a word she turned and walked out, the violin still in her hand. The guests' cheers blurred behind her as tears streamed down her face. She had never felt so seen or so exposed. For all their applause, she still felt the sting of the mockery that began it. Yet, beneath the shame, there was something else. Freedom. For the first time in her life, she'd played for truth, not permission. Alexander stood frozen amid the celebration, the laughter, the wine. His voice cracked as he whispered, "That song, it was hers. How did you know that song?" No one heard him, but his question hung in the air like the echo of a ghost. Because the melody Amara had played wasn't just any tune. It was the same song his late wife had written, one she had never performed outside their home, one she'd called The Promise. He watched Amara disappear into the night, her figure small against the glow of the mansion. Confusion and fear stirred inside him. How could she know that song? Who had taught her? The guests cheered, unaware that in that moment a secret had been uncovered, one that would unravel everything Alexander thought he knew about his past, and about the woman he lost. What connected the maid with the melody of his wife? And why did her music sound like a memory he had tried so hard to forget? Amara slipped through the servants' corridor that night, the sound of applause fading behind her like a dream she didn't trust. In the quiet of her small room, she placed the violin on her bed and stared at it through her tears. That melody, her mother's lullaby, her mother's pain, had escaped her heart before she could stop it. She hadn't meant for anyone to know, least of all him. But Alexander followed. Long after the guests had left, he walked the empty halls, his mind unraveling. That song, the way she played, every note felt like a ghost calling his name. He knocked once on her door. No answer. Then again, softer. "Amara, please." She opened it slowly, eyes red, voice trembling. "If you're here to dismiss me, sir, you don't have to. I'll leave." He shook his head, stepping inside. "No, I just need to know, how did you know that song?" She hesitated, then pulled a small wooden box from beneath her bed. Inside were folded letters, old, fragile, and stained by time. She handed them to him. "They belonged to my mother." He unfolded one and saw a name he hadn't read in years, his wife's. Letter after letter told the story he had buried. Amara's mother and his wife had once been inseparable, childhood friends, bound by music. They had written songs together, one of them called The Promise. But tragedy had driven them apart. One pursued wealth and marriage, the other fled poverty and heartbreak. Then came the fire, the one that took his wife's life. The night he lost everything, Amara's mother had been there, outside, watching the smoke rise. Grief-stricken, she took her daughter and disappeared, carrying only the sheet music they had written together. For years, she raised Amara on the lullabies of a lost friend. That was the music he heard tonight, his wife's song, kept alive through another woman's love. Alexander's voice broke. "So the music I've mourned for all these years was hers, through you." He sank into the chair beside her bed, his hands trembling around the letters. The truth was a blade, painful but cleansing. Amara knelt beside him, whispering, "She never blamed you. My mother said your wife loved you until the very end. She wanted you to remember her through music." In that small, dimly lit room, silence returned, but this time it was gentle. Two people bound by grief, connected by the echoes of the same song. Forgiveness came not through words, but through the understanding that neither had truly lost her. She had lived on in the melody they both carried. He looked at her, his eyes filled with the kind of sorrow that comes when truth arrives too late. "You brought her back to me," he whispered. And for the first time in years he smiled, not with pride but with peace. But fate wasn't done yet, because by morning, whispers from the ballroom had spread beyond the mansion walls, and the entire town was about to learn what happened at that party. By dawn, the echoes of the night had twisted into something cruel. Words spread quickly through the coastal town, the whispers, the laughter, the headlines in hushed tones. The maid who seduced the millionaire. The story grew taller with every retelling. They said she'd played for his affection, that he'd promised her marriage in front of the wealthy, that it was all a spectacle of shame. No one spoke of the music, or the truth it carried. They only saw scandal. By midday, the Morel mansion's gates were lined with carriages and curious eyes. Former guests exchanged amused glances, their laughter echoing through the gardens where Amara had once walked quietly, unseen. To them, she was no longer a mystery, just a cautionary tale. And Alexander Morel, the man once admired for his brilliance, was now the subject of mockery. The newspapers would soon print words like foolish and enchanted. But the cruelest part wasn't what they said about him, it was what they said about her. Servants whispered, maids avoided her gaze. That afternoon the head steward appeared at Amara's door, holding an envelope sealed with the Morel crest. No words were exchanged. She already knew. Her hands trembled as she opened it. A letter of dismissal, signed in Alexander's own handwriting, though she knew it wasn't his will. His family's advisors had intervened, eager to preserve what little reputation remained. Her belongings fit into one small case. The violin rested inside, the only part of her life she couldn't bear to leave behind. As she walked out through the front gates, heads turned. Some pitied her, others smiled faintly, the kind of smile that stings worse than cruelty. Her dress was plain, her shoes worn. The sea breeze caught her hair as she paused for one last look at the mansion she'd once thought might become her home. But she didn't cry. She only whispered to herself, For the second time in my life, music has cost me everything." Inside the house, Alexander watched from the window. He had argued, shouted, even threatened to resign from his board, but it hadn't mattered. His advisors warned him of ruin, his peers mocked him for weakness. When Amara's carriage disappeared down the dirt road, something hollow opened inside him, the realization that he had driven away the only person who had ever understood the sound of his grief. For days he searched the nearby towns, inns, churches, train stations, asking if anyone had seen a young woman carrying a violin case. Each night he returned home to the empty music room, the glass case still open, her touch still lingering on the strings. He could hear her melody in the silence, soft and distant, as though the house itself refused to forget. But when he finally found her, she wasn't playing anymore, and the reason why would change everything. Months passed. The winter storms gave way to spring, and the gossip that once drowned her name slowly faded into memory. Somewhere in the city, beneath the golden light of a grand concert hall, Amara stood again, not as a servant, not as a scandal, but as an artist. The banner outside read simply, "Amara, violin recital for the orphans of the coast." Her mother's promise still lived in her heart, never stop playing. The lights dimmed, the hall fell silent. Then a single note, trembling, tender, filled the air. The same melody that had once echoed through marble corridors now soared beneath crystal chandeliers. But this time, it wasn't sorrow, it wasn't defiance, it was release. Every stroke of her bow was forgiveness, for the world that had judged her, for the man who had lost her, for the past that refused to let go. In the back row, Alexander Morel sat motionless. No entourage, no champagne, just a man, older, quieter, humbled by time and truth. When the music rose to its final crescendo, he closed his eyes and let it wash over him. It was her mother's song, his wife's memory, and Amara's soul, all intertwined. In the years that followed, Alexander Morel never again hosted another grand party. The laughter that once filled his halls had been replaced by something quieter, something kinder. Each year, on the anniversary of that fateful night, he sent a quiet donation to a music academy. No headlines, no applause. Just a name, anonymous, written on the check. The scholarship it funded was for young women who played the violin, those who, like Amara, had nothing but a dream and the courage to hold on to it. And somewhere, beneath a plaque etched in brass, were the words he had chosen himself. Play for love, not for laughter. They say he visited once, sat in the back of the hall as new generations performed her song. No champagne, no mockery, only silence and the sound of redemption carried on strings. Amara's music lived on, not in gossip or grandeur, but in every heart that believed beauty could rise from pain. Because sometimes the people who hurt us the most become the reason we learn what love truly means. Before we end, tell us, what did this story make you feel? And if you were Amara, would you have forgiven Alexander? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss the stories that remind us how deeply human we all are. If this story moved you, leave A in the comments and tell us, would you have played that night? Would you have lifted the bow, knowing the world was watching, laughing, doubting you? Or would you have walked away in silence? Your answer might say more about courage than words ever could. Subscribe for more true, emotional stories every week, because sometimes the most beautiful music is born from heartbreak.